At my sister-in-law's wedding, my seat read, "Single mother waitress." My mother-in-law laughed. "Tonight's waitress is just a used product." The room erupted in laughter. Then my 8-year-old son stood up. He walked to the mic. "I have a gift for the bride, actually." "She is." The room fell silent. Her smile disappeared. Single mother server, Abigail Jones, stood by the window where morning sunlight streamed in. She took a sip of coffee in her small apartment in the Boston suburbs. Her eyes reflected the hardships of life, yet a softness remained in her features. And when she smiled, a youthful glow returned. "Mom, I can't tie my tie," Ethan's voice called from the living room. The 8-year-old boy had a red tie draped around his neck, his fingers awkwardly entangled in it. Abigail smiled gently and knelt in front of her son. "Yes, this is tricky, but don't worry. Mom will help you." As she nimbly fixed her son's tie, she felt her chest tighten at the thought of today, her sister-in-law Sophia's wedding, one of the places she least wanted to be. Abigail had worked as a waitress at the local Maple Diner for over 10 years, long hours from morning till night, meager tips, and the fickle attitudes of regular customers. Yet she never complained, working tirelessly to raise her son. 3 years ago, Abigail's world collapsed when she discovered her husband Daniel was having an affair with his young secretary. Daniel was thriving as an elite employee in the sales department of a major corporation, climbing the career ladder rapidly. For him, a wife who had become just a waitress no longer matched his social status. "I want a divorce," he had told her. Abigail didn't shed a tear that day. She simply nodded, quietly signed the necessary papers, and returned to her parents' home with 5-year-old Ethan. That was her pride. "Ethan, today is a special day. It's your aunt's wedding, so we need to be extra polite." Her son was smart and sensitive. He had felt how Daniel's family, especially his former mother-in-law, Margaret, and sister-in-law, Sophia, had treated his mother. "Grandma Margaret and Aunt Sophia don't like you, do they, Mom?" Abigail looked straight into her son's eyes, trying not to lie. "Adult relationships are complicated, Ethan. They're people from a different world than us, but blood ties remain unchanged." Even as she said this, Abigail remembered Sophia's cruel words every time she gossiped about her being just a waitress. A small wound formed in her heart. Sophia always prided herself on being superior to her, a graduate of a prestigious university, now engaged to Robert, a university professor. And today, she would hold a lavish wedding at a luxury hotel. Her mother-in-law, Margaret, was even harsher. Her class consciousness was strong, and she had never accepted that her son Daniel had married a woman of low status. After the divorce, her contempt for Abigail became even more blatant. Strangely, she was also cold toward her grandson Ethan, treating him almost like evidence of her son's mistake. As she adjusted Ethan's suit, Abigail remembered the wedding invitation, printed on thick, premium paper with gold lettering. It had clearly been sent for appearance's sake. She had initially planned to decline, but when Ethan said, "I want to see Dad," she decided to go for her son's sake. She didn't know how fateful this day would be for her and Ethan and for her former in-laws. "All right, Ethan, let's go." Abigail took a deep breath and smoothed her simple navy dress. She had avoided flashy clothes, trying not to stand out, but unknowingly this enhanced her natural beauty. Before leaving the apartment, she placed her hands on her son's shoulders and said gently, "No matter what happens, we are family. Never forget that." Ethan looked up at his mother and nodded firmly. Getting out of the taxi in front of the luxurious Grand Harbor View Hotel in Boston, Abigail and Ethan hesitated for a moment. Climbing the marble staircase and passing through the lobby with its massive chandeliers, they saw the wedding reception desk ahead. "Miss S. Jones?" The reception staff checked the list and momentarily looked confused. Her eyes moved back and forth between the list and their faces several times. "Please wait a moment," she called another staff member and consulted quietly. Abigail began to feel anxious. She squeezed Ethan's hand tightly and looked around luxurious decorations, perfectly arranged flowers, and people chatting with expensive champagne in hand. She keenly felt that she didn't belong in this world. "I'll show you to your seats." The returning staff member smiled, though she seemed uncomfortable. They were led to a spacious hall with floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a stunning view of Boston Bay. As they approached their seats, Ethan suddenly stopped. "Mom, what's this?" While other relatives' table plates were labeled Jones family or Harris family, Abigail's seat alone was marked single mother waitress. Ethan's seat simply said single mother's child. The blood drained from Abigail's face. She felt an impulse to flee immediately but hesitated when she saw her son's face. Ethan looked confused, his expression mixing anger and embarrassment. "It's okay, Ethan. Just a bad joke." She pretended to be calm, flipped the card over, and took her seat. The venue gradually filled with women in glamorous dresses, men in sophisticated suits. Then Margaret appeared at the entrance. She wore a luxurious silver-gray dress with real pearls gleaming at her neck and ears. "Oh, Abigail, you came." Margaret's voice mixed surprise with slight disappointment. She almost ignored Ethan and left to greet another guest. The solemn sound of the pipe organ began to play, and everyone stood up. From the far end of the aisle, Robert appeared in a white tuxedo. Behind him followed Daniel. Abigail's chest tightened, seeing her ex-husband for the first time in 3 years. He had transformed into an even more successful man. Then the music changed, and Sophia entered, escorted by her father. She was wrapped in a magnificent wedding dress, wearing a smile full of happiness. The venue sighed at her beauty. The ceremony preceded solemnly vows, exchange of rings, and the kiss. The bride and groom looked perfect. Abigail maintained her smile for Ethan's sake, despite her complex feelings. The reception began with champagne and hors d'oeuvres being served. Ethan received orange juice and was curiously observing his surroundings. Soon, it was time for the lavish dinner. "Mom, Dad is looking at us," Ethan whispered. Indeed, Daniel was glancing in their direction but showed no sign of approaching. Instead, a loud clinking of glasses resonated throughout the venue. Margaret stood up and took the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for coming today to celebrate the wedding of my son's sister, my beloved daughter Sophia." She spoke eloquently about the newlyweds and their wonderful future. Then, suddenly, her gaze turned to Abigail. "We have a special guest today, former family member Abigail." All eyes in the venue turned to Abigail. She felt her face flush. "She normally works as a waitress at a restaurant, so I have a suggestion." Margaret's voice dripped with malicious pleasure. "Abigail, since you're a waitress, why don't you help serve dinner today?" The venue fell silent. Abigail sat frozen, humiliation and anger coursing through her body, but Ethan's presence kept her from reacting. "Margaret," even as a joke that someone began to say, but Margaret waved her hand to silence them. "It's not a joke. She's a professional." Margaret's eyes gleamed coldly. The dinner server tonight, not just a second-hand item. Her laughter echoed throughout the room. Gradually, relatives and friends began to laugh too. Many people, including Sophia, joined in the mockery. Even Daniel, though uncomfortable, was smiling. Abigail felt tears welling in her eyes. Her hands trembled, and her throat was dry. She wanted to escape, to disappear from this place. Just as she was about to stand up, there was movement from the seat next to her. Ethan had quietly pulled back his chair and stood up. At the sight of the 8-year-old boy, the laughter in the venue gradually subsided. Ethan's expression showed a calmness and determination beyond his years. He began walking toward the stage where the microphone stood. "Ethan," Abigail tried to call her son back in a low voice, but he had already stepped forward. In complete silence, Ethan stood before the microphone with his small body. He surveyed the adults. "I have a present for the bride." The boy's voice was surprisingly composed. "Actually, she is." As those words echoed through the venue, the smile vanished from Sophia's face. She turned pale, as if she had seen a ghost, and froze. The groom Robert looked at his fiancée with confusion. Daniel hurriedly stood up, trying to call out, "Ethan, That's enough. But the entire venue was waiting for Ethan's next words. Ethan took a deep breath. The atmosphere pressing down on the 8-year-old boy's shoulders was too heavy, but his eyes didn't waver. He adjusted the microphone stand with one hand, put the other in his pocket, and looked around at the adults. "Please stop making fun of my mom," Ethan's voice, though small, clearly resonated throughout the venue. Hundreds of eyes were fixed on him, holding their breath. The blood drained from Margaret's face, and Sophia remained frozen. The groom, Robert, looked around in confusion. "Ethan, come here," Daniel called his son in a low voice. But the boy ignored him. "None of you know my mom," Ethan continued. "She wakes up at 5:00 every morning to make my lunch. She always checks my homework before I go to school, and she stands all day at work, then reads me books at night." Abigail remained frozen in her seat, feeling tears stream down her cheeks. She hadn't known her son had been watching her so closely. "My mom never stops smiling, no matter how tired she is. So nobody has the right to hurt her." Murmurs began to rise from the venue. Margaret hurriedly tried to approach Ethan. "Sweet boy, this is a special day. I'll buy you ice cream later. So let's leave the adult talk for now, shall we?" Ethan quietly shook his head at those words. "I overheard Aunt Sophia and my dad talking." With that single sentence, the venue froze again. Sophia suddenly stood up and grabbed her groom's arm. "Robert, it's a child's imagination. Get him out of here." However, Robert hesitated. Seeing Ethan's calmness and Sophia's panic, he gently removed the bride's hand and quietly sat back down. 3 days ago, when I went to deliver the please reply to Aunt Sophia's house, Dad's car was parked there. Ethan continued matter-of-factly. "I was on my way to piano lessons, but I realized Mom had forgotten to mail an important letter, so I stopped by Aunt Sophia's apartment." Daniel and Sophia's faces visibly paled. The door was slightly open, and I could hear them talking inside. "At first, I thought I'd say hello, but when I heard my name, I stopped and listened." Margaret tried to interrupt again. "What are you saying?" "Today is a day of celebration. In a place like this, a child's made-up story. I have evidence," Ethan said. At those words, Margaret fell silent. The boy took a smartphone out of his pocket. Abigail wondered when her son had gotten a smartphone, then remembered it was a birthday present from Daniel. "I recorded it." Gasps of surprise rose from the venue. Daniel tried to rush forward, but venue staff stopped him. Sophia's face lost its last trace of color, and she stood rigid like a statue. Ethan tapped the screen of his smartphone and held it close to the microphone. First came the sound of rustling, then a clear female voice. "Dan, I want to see Abby's stupid face at the wedding. I'll write single mother waitresses and humiliate her in front of everyone. The plan is perfect. Margaret is on board too. It's going to be the best wedding." Then a male voice, Daniel's, "Be careful. What if people find out you're pregnant with my child? Our relationship will be exposed too." Commotion erupted in the venue. Abigail couldn't believe her ears. Daniel and her sister-in-law on pregnancy? She covered her mouth with trembling hands. The recording continued with Sophia's laugh. "Robert doesn't know anything yet. If I tell him after we're married, it'll be too late. I've calculated the timing so he won't know it's our child." Even more shocking revelations followed. "Since you divorced that woman, you've returned to your true self. We've always been special," Daniel's voice said. "But be careful. Don't tell anyone yet." Ethan stopped the smartphone and quietly returned it to his pocket. The venue was wrapped in complete silence. Groom Robert stood stock still, his face ashen. His family was also stunned. Sophia had begun crying, and Daniel's face was flushed with anger and shame. Margaret collapsed into a chair, speechless with shock. "My mom works hard every day to raise me," Ethan began speaking again. His voice trembled slightly, but his determination remained unwavering. "Aunt Sophia, please stop bullying me with my dad, and you should tell the truth to the man who was supposed to be my new dad." The boy looked at the groom. "I'm sorry, but I thought you had the right to know the truth." The atmosphere in the venue was as cold and heavy as ice. Robert slowly stood up and stared at Sophia, his eyes mixing anger and sadness. "Is this true?" His voice trembled. Sophia covered her face with both hands and began crying violently. "No, Ethan is lying. It's a child's made-up story." She desperately denied it, but her breakdown told the whole story. Margaret recovered and stepped forward to contain the situation. "Everyone, this is clearly a misunderstanding. It's an excited child's imagination. Please don't ruin this wonderful day with such nonsense." However, Robert's father stood up and said sternly, "Has our family been deceived? Son, let's go. This marriage should be reconsidered." The groom's family began to stand up en masse. Robert gave the bride one final look and said, "Was it true, Sophia? Tell me." She couldn't answer. Instead, Daniel stood up. "Enough," he said in a heavy voice. "Let's tell the truth." As the venue watched with bated breath, Daniel bowed his head. "It's true that I've been having a relationship with Sophia, and she is pregnant with my child." With those words, the venue fell into complete chaos. All color drained from Robert's face, and he staggered backward. His mother rushed to support her son. Robert's father was furious and tried to confront Daniel, but people around him held him back. Ethan put down the microphone and stepped off the stage. He walked to his mother and placed his small hand over Abigail's. "I'm sorry, Mom, but I couldn't stand seeing them hurt you." Abigail couldn't find words. She embraced her son, pouring all of herself into that small body. The surrounding chaos felt like distant noise to her. Her world now consisted only of this brave boy. Sophia continued crying violently, beginning to blame Daniel. Margaret was fiercely scolding both her son and daughter. Cries of family disgrace. "How could you do this?" echoed through the venue. Amidst the chaos, Abigail took Ethan's hand and quietly said, "Let's go home." They quietly rose from their seats and headed toward the exit with dignity intact. On their way, a voice called from behind, "Wait, please." Turning around, they saw the groom Robert walking toward them with shaking steps. His face was pale and his eyes were bloodshot. The man who should have been the star of the wedding now looked like a broken doll. "Is it really true?" he asked Ethan, his voice low so others couldn't hear. Ethan looked straight into Robert's eyes and nodded slightly. "I'm not lying. The recording is real." Robert closed his eyes painfully. His expression was etched with pain and the sadness of betrayal. Abigail felt sympathy for him. They were in similar situations. "Your son is brave," Robert said weakly. "To think that a small child would have the courage to speak the truth among adults." He placed his hand on Ethan's shoulder and quietly said, "Thank you." From inside the venue, the commotion continued. Sophia's crying, Margaret's angry shouts, and the voices of confused guests all mingled together. Sophia came out from the venue. Her wedding dress was disheveled, and her once perfect makeup was ruined by tears. She desperately grabbed Robert's arm and pleaded with him. "That's a lie. It's a child's delusion. Believe me." Robert slowly shook off her hand. "Daniel admitted it, didn't he? He's the father of the baby, right?" His voice was ice cold. "That's not true. He's just confused." Sophia was desperate. "It's our wedding. We've been in love for 5 years. Don't destroy that over this." Robert shook his head and said quietly, "I've loved you for 5 years, but you betrayed my trust with your brother, no less." He cut off his words and struggled to breathe. "I need time to think." Then Daniel appeared too. He seemed to have escaped from the chaos inside. His attire was also disheveled, and his face showed intense turmoil. "Sophia, stop lying," he said in a tired voice. "It's all my responsibility." "Robert, I apologize. We both of you are responsible," Margaret cut in. Her anger was now directed at both her son and daughter. "You've ruined the family's honor. How could you do something so shameful?" Margaret glared at Abigail and Ethan. "You two are just as guilty, exposing family shame in such a public place." Abigail remembered 3 years of humiliation and pain, all the contempt and insults she had endured. And today, the final humiliation. She had tried to endure silently for her son's sake, but it was over now. She straightened her back and said in a calm voice, "You should be the ones to know shame. Your son had an inappropriate relationship with his sister, resulting in a child, and to hide that, you tried to marry an innocent person. We only revealed the truth." Margaret had no response to those words. Sophia was now collapsed in tears, kneeling on the floor. "Robert, please don't leave me." The groom's father approached and grabbed his son's shoulder. "Let's go, son. We shouldn't associate with this family." He looked at Abigail and Ethan and slightly bowed his head. "Thank you for telling us the truth." As Robert's family left, the groom still stood in front of Sophia, dragging his feet. "Is the baby really Daniel's?" he asked finally. Sophia couldn't answer and just kept crying. Her silence told the whole story. Robert slowly removed his ring and placed it before her. "Goodbye, Sophia." His words sounded like a final farewell, and he too left, following his family. Daniel sat down next to Sophia and put his arm around her shoulders. He looked up at Abigail once, then closed his mouth as if at a loss for words. His eyes showed the color of remorse. Margaret held her head in confusion, muttering, "What do I do? What happens now?" Her arrogance had disappeared in an instant, and she now looked like a weak, elderly woman. Abigail took Ethan's hand and said quietly, "Let's go home. There's no reason for us to be here anymore." As they were leaving the venue, Robert appeared before them again. He hesitated as if to say something, then bowed deeply. "Your son is brave. Thank you for telling me the truth. I was blind." His voice mixed gratitude and sadness. Abigail smiled gently. "Time will heal. May we both have new beginnings." Outside, the evening air enveloped them. They got into a taxi waiting in front of the hotel, and Abigail gave their address. "I'm sorry, but it's a bit far. Is that okay?" she asked the driver. The driver looked at the mother and son in the back seat and smiled warmly. "No problem, ma'am. Have a nice evening, both of you." As the car started moving, Abigail hugged her son tightly. "Ethan, you're my hero." Ethan buried his face in his mother's chest and said in a small voice, "Did I do something bad?" Abigail gently stroked her son's hair and shook her head. "No, you spoke the truth with courage. That's never a bad thing." But complex emotions swirled in her heart, the shock of her ex-husband and sister-in-law's betrayal, and the fact that they had a child from their relationship. She now understood the reason for Daniel's cold attitude after the divorce and his indifference toward Ethan, and above all, the anxiety about how today's events would change their lives. Would Daniel and his family seek revenge against them? How would Ethan continue his relationship with his father? But tonight, she decided to put those worries aside. Now was the time to celebrate her son's courage and love. "Mom, I'm hungry," Ethan whispered. Abigail laughed and kissed his cheek. "Yes, we didn't get dinner at that place, did we? Let's buy some hamburgers on the way home and eat them in peace at home." The taxi continued through the evening darkness, and mother and son leaned against each other quietly, heading toward an uncertain but new beginning. Tonight's events had changed their lives forever, but Abigail believed it was a change for the better. "Ethan," she said quietly, "from now on, let's live strongly together. You really are a wonderful child." Ethan looked up at his mother and nodded slightly. His eyes held an adult-like determination. Today, he had become the protagonist of his own life. 3 months later, on an autumn afternoon, Abigail straightened her new uniform at Maple Diner, looking at herself in the mirror. A deputy manager badge gleamed on her chest. "Congratulations, Abby!" Her colleagues surrounded her with bouquets, a well-deserved promotion. Since that day, her life had begun to move in unexpected directions. The restaurant owner, appreciating her years of loyalty and diligence, had offered her a promotion to deputy manager. "I was impressed by your strength and patience," the owner had said, restoring her confidence. Meanwhile, the events at Sophia's wedding had become the talk of the town, and people's reactions were surprising. Many supported Abigail and Ethan, praising their courageous actions. Sophia had left town to escape the disgrace. starting a new life in a city hundreds of miles away. Ironically, she was now raising a child as a single mother herself. She who once looked down on Abigail was now experiencing the same hardships. Daniel had lost his position at the company, and his social reputation had plummeted. He had contacted Abigail several times, saying he wanted to try again, but she firmly refused, saying, "We're over. I'm walking a new path in life." Margaret became isolated within the family and lost her standing in social circles. Her son and daughter's forbidden relationship had dealt a fatal blow to her arrogance. One day, Abigail received an apology letter from her. After much inner conflict, she sent a brief reply saying, "I can let it go, but that's different from forgiveness. Mom, look." Ethan returned from school, showing her a test paper. "A plus." Abigail hugged her son. Ethan took pride in his mother's transformation and had become respected by his friends at school as a champion of justice. His small action had not only changed his mother's life, but also contributed to his own growth. In the evening, Abigail was preparing to head to her night class at the local community college. A few weeks after that day, she had received a scholarship to pursue the nutrition degree she had given up on years ago. With Ethan staying at Aunt Emily's next door, she absorbed new knowledge as a student 3 days a week. "Mom, can you become a restaurant owner in the future?" Ethan asked. Abigail smiled. "Yes, I can. I've just taken the first step." Now, she no longer felt ashamed of being a single mother but took pride in it. The bond between her and her son had become even stronger since that day. Sometimes she remembered the events at that wedding. If Ethan hadn't stood up that day, I might still have lost sight of my own value, she realized. Life sometimes unfolds in unexpected ways. The wedding that was meant to humiliate her had opened the door to a new life for her and her son. "Ready?" she asked Ethan. They had promised to watch his favorite movie after her class tonight. Ethan nodded brightly. "Yes, Mom. We're the strongest team." Abigail gently stroked her son's hair. Their story was not an ending, but a beginning.